Closely associated with prorations is the concept of interim interest. Now, while it's not technically a proration, it's still going to be important for you to know that strategy when solving for interim interest. Now, let me tell you what interim interest is. Most buyers who are buying property are receiving a loan to purchase the property. Now, having said that, if for some reason the question does not involve a loan, you will not deal with interim interest. But when a buyer borrows money, it's a buyer to you, it's a borrower to the bank. I don't know if you've ever thought about the timeline about when the borrower's first payment is due. So let's say we're buying a property in July, call that July 1st, August 1st, September 1st. So let's say that we're closing on July 23rd. July 23rd is the closing date. Technically, you don't have a mortgage payment on August 1st. What the lender does is they set up the payment so that your first payment is September 1st, and you pay the interest that accrues for the month of August. You pay that on September 1st. Well, if you take a look at this, if you're paying August interest on September 1st, when are you paying the remainder of the month, July's interest? That is your interim interest. And the answer to the question is the buyer brings that money to closing. Okay, so interim interest pays for the little bit of money, the little bit of interest at the end of the month that they close in. So let's take a look at how this is going to work. And this also going to involve another function you've learned earlier in the class, and that is the interest formula. Let me remind you, when I do the interest formula, I typically say something like this. I usually say annual interest equals principal times rate. So in this particular problem, I'm going to tell you, now keep in mind, the problem's telling you this information. That's a $180,000 loan amount. It'll either tell you that or give you a way to get to the loan amount. It's 6% interest. And the question in this case is, how do we find the interim interest? How do we find how much interest there was for this little period of time right here? Okay, so let's trust our interest formula. So here's what our interest formula says. Multiply principal times rate. $180,000 times 6%. Now, while this is an interesting number, 10,800, it represents annual interest. You may look at that and go, wow, that's a lot of interest. Well, keep in mind that's for the whole year because that's what the formula gives you. But in solving for interim interest, I need to figure out how much it is per day. Well, do you remember how many days there are in a year in our problems? 360. So 1,080 divided by 360 equals $30 per day. And again, I just chose nice round numbers here to make it easy for our calculations. Okay, so here's what happens. Every day that you've had the bank's money from July 23rd to August 1st is costing you $30 per day. It's technically costing you that in August as well, but the fact of the matter is you're going to pay that on September 1st. So at closing, we're going to pay this amount of money right here, now per day. Now here comes the interesting thing about interim interest. In regards to interim interest, I'm going to recommend that you do as I tell you right here. If you want to do your own way, that's fine. But I always do this to slow myself down and remind myself what's going on. In calculating the days of interim interest, what you do is you take the number of days in a month, 30, you subtract the closing date, the 23rd, and then you add 1 day. Interim interest is a little bit unique in that the buyer always pays for the day of closing. When it comes to interim interest, you say, well, why does the buyer pay for the day of closing? It's his loan. So therefore, the seller has nothing to do with the buyer's loan. So he pays the 7 days at the end of the month plus the day of closing, the 23rd. And if you were to count it on your fingers, starting with the 23rd, you would see that is correct. So 30 minus 23 is 7, plus 1 is 8. And I know you're thinking I'm spending way too much time on that, but I'm telling you that's the step that most people miss in the interim interest question. So it's 8 days of interim interest times $30 per day equals $240. $240. Now, interestingly enough, This is a debit to the buyer. But as I suggested to you, this has nothing to do with the seller because it has nothing to do with the seller's loan. I'll show you a little bit later how to deal with the seller's loan. But for right now, interim interest, remember your interest formula, principal times rate, and then we're going to divide it by 360 because we want to know the number of days, the number per day. And then we figure out the number of days of interim interest, which is 30 minus the closing date plus 1, 8 days, times the $30 a day that you saw here. Buyer, in this case, a single debit to the buyer of $240, and it pays for the interest that accrued during that last little bit of the month. The bank wants to be paid every day the interest that is owed to them. That's your interim interest problem.